Hello, I'm Joe Devine, and welcome to the Tifo Football Podcast. Today I was joined by Alex Stewart. We decided to do an Arsene Wenger retrospective. Of course, over the weekend, Arsene Wenger announced his decision to retire from football management. After a very long and extraordinarily successful career, the last 2 decades or so of which have of course been at Arsenal Football Club, so Alex and I decided to take a retrospective look at his time at Arsenal, examine his tactical evolution. We identify 3 distinct periods, and we talk about his successes and some minor failures in each of those periods. So do stick around for that, but before we get to it, I wanted to take this opportunity to talk to the people who watch our videos on YouTube. As some of you might know, if you watch other video creators on YouTube, there have been some changes to the subscribe button in recent months, and we haven't really brought it up until now, but we've noticed in the last couple of months or so that a number of our videos aren't making it out to the people who've subscribed to the channel. So if you are one of those people and you do want to be notified of when we post a video, which is pretty much every day other than the weekends at the moment, when you're watching a Tifo video, you'll see the subscribe button below. There'll be a little bell next to it. If you click on that bell, it gives you the option to choose to be notified sometimes when we upload videos, never, or all the time. And obviously, I think you should choose all of the time. So if you get a moment and you want to watch more of our videos, or you want to be notified when we upload them, as I said, it's 5 days a week at the moment, please take the time to go and do that. It will really help us out, and hopefully it will be fulfilling for you also. Anyway, that's enough of that for now. Here's the jazz flute. So let's begin before the Invincibles, leading up to the Invincibles season. One of the things that is often said about Arsene Wenger, Alex, is that when he arrived, he inherited a defence that was drilled by the great George Graham, and was one of the best defences in the league at the time. That's true, isn't it?
Yes, definitely. That's that set of players is one of the best backlines that we've seen in the Premier League. So you had 2 of Steve Bold, Tony Adams or Martin Keown, and then the fullbacks were Lee Dixon and Nigel Winterburn, and they were obviously all playing in front of David Seaman, who was kind of in his pomp at that period. And it was, I suppose in some regards, you'd kind of look at it as being quite a traditional back four, in that the fullbacks didn't push particularly high up, and there was I suppose a slight balance. Adams was.
It was no nonsense.
Well, yeah, I think he was no nonsense to a degree. I think he wasn't the most skillful passer of the ball, but I think positionally he was a very good defender. These were all defenders who could definitely go to ground and put in, a strong sliding challenge if necessary. We're not talking about a Paolo Maldini here, but there was an elegance to them, I think, that kind of belied that physicality. It wasn't always necessary to kind of get thuggish and force people off the ball. They were very good. They were also very organised, and this is the thing that people, come back to time and again with them, is the drilling of that back four, the repetitive actions to push up. All of them raising their hands at the same time to claim an offside. That level of organisation and that level of communication required for that is just the result of repetitive drilling, which I think is what George Graham kind of instilled in them. Of course, Steve Bold is Arsenal's defensive coach now, so there's kind of a legacy there as well. But it was, I think if you're coming into a new club, having a foundational building block upon
Dream
which
scenario, right?
Well, yes, and and obviously also one of Wenger's really great signings, Patrick Vieira. The transfer of Vieira was arranged before Wenger joined the club, but in the period in which it was known that he was going to join the club, so it was his directive to sign Vieira. So he was there as well. And I think if you're looking to build a team. And of course, we can't necessarily get into anybody's head at that period, and and say that Wenger had any kind of sense that he was going to build this dynasty that would last for 20 plus years. But anybody with any kind of eye to the future is going to want to start to lock into place the foundations of a team that will last a good number of seasons. And the two great dynasty builders of the Premier League era, Wenger and Alex Ferguson, did the same thing. They looked to have key players in key positions that would be able to continue at that club for 4 or 5 plus years.
Yeah. It's interesting you talk about Arsene Wenger's foresight there. I was reading a few articles last night about him in preparation for this podcast, and one of them mentioned something I don't think I knew before, which was that the season prior to Arsenal's Invincibles season, Arsene Wenger publicly stated that he thought the club was going to go unbeaten that year. And obviously it didn't happen. It happened the following year, But that's quite that's quite a cocky thing to suggest, albeit it came true. I wanted to stay on the theme of defence because, as we said, when he arrived, it was a sort of dream scenario. There's a wonderful, very well drilled defence already there, and he basically didn't have to do anything with it. However, by the time we get to the Invincibles era, I think lots of people often forget that Arsene Wenger built his own defence for that. I think the only survivor by that point was Martin Keown, and the other 3 players. He wasn't playing regularly at the time either. The other regular 4 players, there was Lauren and Ashley Cole, who were both converted wingers. There was Kola Toure, who was a converted central midfielder, and there was Sol Campbell, who even was a teenager, had played up front. There was a real emphasis on speed and ball control, wasn't there?
Yeah, and I think if you look at signings that Wenger made, being able to convince Sol Campbell to come from Spurs on a free transfer is one of the great kind of coups of modern football in England as a signing. And Campbell was, for all the opprobrium that attached itself to him at the time, some of which was obviously deeply unpleasant, and also with the subsequent issues that he's gone on to have in terms of some of the things he's said, that I don't think anybody would argue that Campbell's one of the best defenders that we've seen, in the last sort of 20 or 30 years. And he was a good passer of the ball. Campbell was the kind of player who was capable of bringing it forwards out of defence if he needed to. He didn't tend to do it that much because Toure was even better at it, as you correctly said, converted defensive midfielder. And then, playing alongside them, you had Lauren and Ashley Cole, who had both played everywhere up and down their respective sides. And because of that, were able to control the ball, were able to run with the ball, were able to get forwards and cross it. And that, I think, was one of the innovations that he brought, that sense of saying, well, if we want to have players who are able to work the ball forwards out of defence, carry it with them, in order that the whole team can move forwards, that we can compress the space, that we can set ourselves up for rapid counter-attacks, particularly out wide, then without any disrespect, particularly to Lee Dixon and Nigel Winterburn, who were extremely capable fullbacks, that additional pace and that additional ability to spot an attacking opportunity, he wanted players that were much more used to that style of football. And the easiest way for him to do that was, not to try and find maybe the 1 or 2 players in world football who were capable of it at the time, but to get younger players and say, right, let's make you into a fullback.
And important to note that, certainly in the fullback's case, both were sceptical initially.
Well, I think you probably would be. I mean, it's, I think for a start, it's probably seen as a less glamorous possession. It's maybe seen in some regards as a less integral position to, the perception of a team's abilities is still usually how it goes forwards. I mean, people rarely talk about the beauty of a defensive shape or, how people push up. It's very much how they go forwards and how they attack. And so I think if you're is probably a testament to what Wenger's been able to do for the majority of his career, although I think this is something that has waned of late, is to convince people to go along with what he's doing. And I think, that was evident right from the get-go in terms of him coming to the club, because obviously he had, he was coming from Japan, where people hadn't really heard of him. A lot of people in English football hadn't heard of him. He'd had, previous stints with Monaco, but that, it hadn't necessarily brought him to the attention of a league that still kind of considered itself to be the best league in the world at that point, and probably with some justification. And, he came in with these newfangled ideas about what you should be eating and the exercises you should be doing and all of this kind of stuff. And quite rapidly got players of the caliber of Tony Adams to go, yeah, okay, cool, let's give this guy a chance. And again, if you're able to do that, then ultimately you can sit a young player like Ashley Cole down and say, look, I think the best way for you to bring success to this team, the endeavour that I have in mind, is for you to do this. And if you're able to convince players like that, Ashley Cole is a fantastic left back. Then that's one of the ways that you can achieve success. And I think he very cleverly realised that you needed that sort of ball control and that sort of ability everywhere across the pitch.
Well, in his own way, he sounds a little bit to me, and I am more the layman here, but he sounds to me like Pep Guardiola sounds now. I mean, if we look at what he did with that defence after the solid structure that he arrived with, the defence he built for the Invincibles season was focused on fast players. He realised the strikers were getting faster, and you needed to compensate for that by having a faster defence. That defence went unbeaten in the Premier League, which is something that had never happened, or had only happened with Derby, right, in the 1800s. So that's quite an incredible achievement, and he's done that by converting players who are naturally playing in other. Oh yeah, it was Preston, yeah, naturally playing in other positions. And converting them, I mean, that sounds an awful lot like what Pep Guardiola does now with his wing backs, with his full backs. I mean, is it fair to call Arsene Wenger an innovator in that way?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, these guys, Lauren and Cole, they had been fullbacks they've been playing at fullback in the 2 seasons previous, so it wasn't like. I
don't think Lauren had he? I mean, I know Ashley Cole had, but Lauren, I think when he arrived at the club, hadn't he been playing right wing? He
played right midfield because they were playing more of a 4-4-2, but he definitely played right back in that 2001-2 season as well.
Right.
So what I'm saying is that it was a gradual change, yes, and they, I mean, the 2001, I think it's 2001-2 team went unbeaten away from home.
That's right.
So it was still a pretty quick transition. I think
in that season they also scored in every single league game as well, which I think was a record at the time.
I didn't know that. That's impressive.
It's overshadowed by the Invincibles season I read last night. Very interesting what you can read on the internet.
Yes, it's the internet's great, isn't it? Yeah. So it wasn't. It wasn't an immediate change. I think there's a slight difference between this and what Guardiola has done insofar as, I mean, yes, they are both innovators in their way, and interestingly, they're innovators who are largely wedded to one style of playing, and the innovations are not. They're not philosophical innovations or even kind of systematic innovations. They're innovations on a player level, which is, I think, quite an interesting crossover between the two. But Wenger's changes were sort of more significant and over a longer period of time in terms of taking a player that was used to doing one thing and gradually instructing them on how to do something else. Whereas what Guardiola does is, I think he schools all of his players so well in his positional style that, if required occasionally, then anyone could probably fit in anywhere else. I don't think it's quite the same. It's not like he sat Fabian Delph down at the beginning of the season and said, right, you are now going to be a left back and this is how you're going to play it. It's that Delph was part of that squad and exposed to that system of football for a significantly long time, and obviously also an intelligent and capable footballer, that when it was required, when Mendy got injured and Delph had to step into that role, just like Zinchenko did occasionally as well, that he was able to adapt to it. So I think what Wenger did was sort of a longer term plan based on what he felt his footballers should be able to do, whereas what Guardiola does is to say all my footballers should be able to do this, and therefore they can probably all play in all the different positions. I mean, you wouldn't play Sergio Aguero at centre back, but you Aguero.
Who's that?
Yeah, very funny. But you could play Kevin De Bruyne in probably in the right wing back role if you really wanted to. You could play. David Silva further back in the Fernandinho role. They would know what to do because they're so used to how that system works.
Okay, so we can move on to the next sort of significant era of Arsene Wenger at Arsenal, and I would describe that as the Emirates era. Of course, they moved from Highbury to the fabled Emirates, and the club required stabilising financially, which meant that the team had to sell, a number of their better players and weren't necessarily able to replace them like for like. So perhaps one of the biggest challenges of Arsene Wenger's job began at this point in time, keeping the team in the top four, keeping a level of consistency in the play style, with less money than he was previously doing that. And over the course of 3 or 4 years, we can see significant names leaving the team. Ashley Cole left in 2006-07. In 07-08, Thierry Henry and Antonio Reyes, Lassana Diarra, Freddie Ljungberg. And these players were frequently replaced by young hopefuls. It was around the same time, a few years earlier, we saw Van Persie arrive. Players like Andrei Arshavin and Samir Nasri arrived. Aaron Ramsey came. Mikel Silvestre, hey, not a young player, but a player in the form of the sort of quick fullbacks we were talking about before. But the real player that I want to focus on in this period of time is Cesc Fabregas. A very young Cesc Fabregas, who arrived at Arsenal, I believe he was 19 years old, something like that. And at the time, on the world stage, Spain were setting football alight, weren't they, Alex, with their possession, based play, their tiki-taka, and Arsene Wenger saw this, and we'll never know whether he thought, perhaps that's something that we can do with a smaller budget, perhaps that's a sort of safer way of playing, or maybe he thought that was genuinely the way to glory. Either way, Cesc Fabregas arrived. Oh, fuck's sake, I can't talk. Cesc Fabregas arrived. Why can't I say arrived after... Cesc Fabregas arrived, and Arsene Wenger began to build his team around this player. I believe it was at this point that they moved to a sort of 5 in midfield for the first time to accommodate him. Is that correct, Alex?
Yeah, they they sort of, I guess, oscillated between something resembling a kind of 4-3-3 and a 4-5-1. And I think that the purpose of this was very much to say that Fabregas was, he should concentrate on creativity, on finding passes forwards to people like Arshavin, and not worry too much about the defensive side of stuff. This is, Alex Song was in. Danielson, Mathieu Flamini, those kind of guys were providing the sort of the muscle either side of Fabregas, who was there to kind of scheme and create. And I think the interesting thing about I don't know, tiki-taka or that style of controlling possession and perhaps being a little more methodical and waiting for the gaps to appear and to try and create those overloads and then move suddenly at pace forwards was that it wasn't too divorced from what Arsenal had been doing already. Arsenal's Invincibles team was very much about pace and about it. It wasn't a counter-attacking team in the sense that it could only counter-attack. It absolutely could control the game, but there was a way that they had of transitioning the ball very, very quickly forwards, and then these sort of quick, intricate passing manoeuvres, and all of a sudden you find yourself conceding a goal. And I think what Wenger saw with the sort of Spanish style of football was the same level of speed of thought and movement in the final third that he actually already believed in and already had his players capable of doing. And it was more about being able to kind of control the build-up to that, and for it not necessarily to require this very quick counter-attacking out-wide kind of movement. That actually, if you had a player of the quality of Fabregas who was able to sort of control the movement of the ball forwards into that final third, when it then sprang into life as a kind of, a slightly older style Arsenal did, then that was perhaps, like you say, maybe a safer way of doing it. That if your defence wasn't necessarily of the same quality as the defence that he had in the kind of the Sol Campbell era or the era before that, then actually keeping possession and being more methodical afforded the opposition fewer opportunities to attack themselves.
And arguably, regardless of what the system is, you could make the argument that having a consistent system and outlook and philosophy for that period of time is going to help players who perhaps weren't as technically proficient or at the top of their game as the Invincibles team were, obviously. At least if, as you were describing, Pep Guardiola before is describing to every one of his players what the system is and how it works. If Arsene Wenger can say over the course of 4 or 5 seasons that this is how we play and this is what we do, that's going to be useful when you're bringing new players in and when you're trying to deal with big players leaving, because I suppose one of his concerns was if the club doesn't have money to spend, which for 4 or 5, 6, maybe even 7 years you could stretch to, they weren't bringing in big name players. They were losing big name players and they were replacing them with decent players. And I suppose if you are aware that that's going to happen to your team, you're going to lose all your best players, you really need to design a system that doesn't require them in the same way, right? And presumably having a consistent philosophical outlook and playing a sort of style of football like possession-based football is a good way of ameliorating that.
Yeah, that's certainly true. There was an interesting graph that was put out on Twitter yesterday, so that would be Sunday, listeners, about Swansea, and it was I think the x-axis was possession and the y-axis was passing accuracy, and what it showed was that Swansea in, I think, 2012-13 or something, whenever the Brendan Rodgers period were playing very high possession and very high pass completion, and that gradually the team over time, as we get to the current season, it's changed its style altogether. That it's literally it's an incremental step between each season as they've held possession less and made fewer passes accurately. And that is essentially interesting. It's interesting if you're a Swansea fan for various reasons, but what it says is that team has drastically changed its identity in 5 years, which is not a long time. And so if you're a player that was brought in 2012, 13, 2014 to play that style of football, then very possibly only 2 or 3 years later, 2 or 3 seasons later, you are outmoded. You're not suited to what they're now trying to do. And that obviously has a massive knock-on in terms of transfers. It has a knock-on in terms of players who want to play that style of football, becoming frustrated and wanting to leave, etc., etc. So with Arsenal, trying to build a sense of continuity and to say, I think Wenger would have been able to say two things to his players. Firstly, you know how I like to play football, and I like to play it in an attractive, engaging way. And the second thing is I have a track record of taking players either who've played in one position and adding to their abilities by getting them to play somewhere else, or I've taken young players and transformed them into some of the best players in the world, i.e. Thierry Henry. If you join us in this project, yes, there's not a lot of money going around necessarily. Yes, some of the squad is a little bit thin, but you know what I'm able to deliver. And that may not be necessarily a Premier League trophy, but I will make you better, and I will make you better within a system of football that people rightly admire. And I think if you're trying to compensate for the fact that you can't chuck money around in the same way, I mean, I don't think they were ever necessarily massive spenders. It's Sol Campbell, pretty, on a free transfer. Yes, big wages, sure, but Van Persie, Henry, none of these guys are like massive splashes of money.
No, but I think the issue is in the context of a league where other teams are spending a lot of money. I mean, they were competing directly with Manchester United for many of the Invincibles years, and Manchester United were obviously spending money, and so I think it's less about the principles of the team, more about the context of the league.
Yeah, and I think that brings us to a degree onto another point that's worth making, which is that when Wenger came in, a lot of the things that he brought with him, in terms of nutrition, in terms of scouting, in terms of an awareness of the global game rather than just the game within the British Isles, all of that stuff was new or pretty new to the Premier League, and that gave him the jump to a degree on the other managers that were operating at that time. Now that's not to say that it was because he got his players to eat broccoli that he won lots of stuff, because clearly, there's a lot more to it, and there's, his tactical ability is part of that. But the stuff that put him ahead of the curve to start with, gradually teams saw the efficacy of doing certain things in a way that Wenger had introduced them to, and caught up. And at that point, you then kind of, I suppose, have to make a decision if you're Arsenal, and say, okay, well, the competitive advantage that we had because we were getting our players to do all of these different things that no one else was doing, and we were scouting in a certain way, and we were finding these players, that now there's competition for those guys, and now other clubs have got scouting networks throughout France or throughout Africa or wherever it is, and where do we look for the next competitive advantage? And unfortunately, I think increasingly competitive advantage within the Premier League became about spending money. And that kind of period is when transfer fees really started to accelerate in those last sort of 5 or 6 years. And that was somewhere where Arsenal couldn't necessarily compete or didn't want to compete. I mean, they do have cash surpluses at the moment and have had for a little while, but I think there's a natural caution there. So, if you're not going to compete,
well, actually, if you look at their incomings, this kind of brings us on to the third and most up to date Wenger period, which I think I would categorise as the period after the financial conservatism. Because Arsenal have spent a fair amount of money. If you stretch back to, I think it's 2013-14 is the year. It's the first year that they made a significant transfer since they moved to the Emirates. Then they brought in Mesut Ozil for £42 million. The following year they brought in Alexis Sanchez for £38 million. The following year they brought in Peter Cech. That's not lots of money. The year after that they brought in Granit Xhaka for £40 million, Mustafi for £36 million, and of course this season Aubameyang for 57, Lacazette for 47. That's quite a lot of money to spend in 5 years' time, and I think that is, obviously it's increasing over that period. If you look at how Arsenal have performed in the league for the last 5 years as well. I think initially you can see that paying off, and I think that's one of the things that would have given the owners and Arsene Wenger hope, is that so they finished second in 2015-16. I remember they played very well that season, and Sanchez and Ozil were combining brilliantly, and there was a thought, that perhaps, okay, the man's got money to spend again, and this is what he's capable of doing with it. And obviously, it sort of fell off a cliff last year, and this maybe perhaps that's too strong a metaphor, but I mean, they're currently sixth, likely to finish there. They finished fifth last season. I think that experiment has failed, but I can absolutely see why Arsene Wenger has even managed to weather those Emirates years with a real grace, and I think there was definitely an opportunity for him to come back, hence finishing second in 2016. But the money's definitely there, and they're definitely spending it. I mean, it's just for whatever reason it hasn't worked. And one of the things that interested me about Arsene Wenger over the last couple of days since he announced his retirement at the end of the season, he said that in recent years a lack of unity in the fans has been hurtful to the club, and I think it's difficult to imagine for a second that he doesn't mean people being divisive over his job. And I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, he's. It's very difficult to obviously to work out exactly what is meant by this, but I could certainly have sympathy with him feeling a lack of gratitude, because his longevity in that role is something to which particularly younger fans generally in football are seriously unaccustomed to. There's been God knows how many managerial changes in the period that he's been in charge, but it's going to be hundreds and hundreds. And it's, I think that sense of, we spend money on players. If it doesn't work, we change the manager. There's a kind of a sense of things rolling on in the constant pursuit of immediate success, which is what most fans want for their club. And by that I mean, if they don't get that success, they're prepared for that changing and for that throwing of money at players, because they believe that that's how success will be achieved. And to me, there's absolutely no surprise that the two greatest managers of the Premier League era are the two managers that were given the longest periods of time at their club, in Ferguson and Wenger. And I think...
Is that a sort of chicken and egg situation, though? I mean, are they arguably the greatest, and therefore they were allowed to stay?
I think it's both. I think it's incredibly difficult to say which came first, but both of those managers had difficult periods at their clubs, and
both grew more conservative in their approach towards the end as well.
That's also true. Both, I think, as they got older, their transfer signings got worse as well, to a degree. I think there's always an argument that people cling on too long, and maybe you could be seriously uncharitable and say that Wenger basically turned into a kind of a despot at Arsenal who wanted to control every aspect of the club, lost his touch, couldn't see that he'd lost his touch, turned on the fans, or indeed anybody who quite reasonably criticised him and wanted him to go, and that's utterly tarnished his legacy. Or you could say this was somebody who'd brought sustained success to the club and believed in his own ability, with the evidence of preceding years, that he was able to bring that back at some point. And that they had it's 3 FA Cups in the last 5 seasons, qualified for the Champions League in 4 of those, I think. That's not a bad rate of return for most teams, and you can't know whether Wenger was sort of sitting there last season or the season before thinking, I just need one more guy to be the missing piece of this jigsaw, or it's pointless speculating about that stuff. But I do think, yes, I think they got more. I think he got more conservative. I think he started to make mistakes in signings. I think it's very hard to look at a player other than Sanchez really in the last sort of 4 or 5 years who's been an unqualified success. I'm trying to think when.
Koscielny?
Yeah, Koscielny's the only other one that I would have said. Is in
Cazorla,
that bracket.
when he's not been injured.
Well, Cazorla has, but Cazorla's not an unqualified success because he spent so much time injured. And I know that's not his fault, and I know it's probably not the club's fault, but you can't you can't work out how good or how important he could have been to Arsenal, except perhaps by inference because of what him not being there has then done to them. So, he could have been an unqualified success if he'd stayed fit, but it's you don't look at a lot of these people and
people will be screaming at the train floor on their commute now, going, "No, other Arsenal players were great." I can't think of.
There are some good people that have been brought in. I think 2 of the Spanish signings, Bellerin and Monreal, have both been good, but I don't think there's been a transformative signing, and I think that's what is again interesting about. You can also make the comparison with Alex Ferguson, that at certain points of Wenger's career and Ferguson's career, there have been signings, and these don't necessarily have to be big money signings either. But there have been signings that have been transformative. And for Ferguson, you could look at Cantona, you could look at Roy Keane, arguably you could look at Rio Ferdinand. And these are people who, Cristiano Ronaldo, who have injected something into the team, who have elevated it.
Van Persie, possibly the biggest example of that.
Yes.
In the later stages, I should say.
Right. And I think for Wenger, likewise, when he came in, Vieira, I think Henry, Gilberto Silva, there were players, and I think that's what the Mesut Ozil deal was. I think he was looking for another of those after a kind of fallow period.
Do you think Mesut Ozil's let him down?
No, I think people are very harsh about Ozil, but I think he's a wonderful player at a certain style. I think what didn't necessarily happen was that the team was constructed in such a way as to maximise his abilities to do what he was doing. That maybe if had they more regularly played with a third central midfielder and not kind of gone for the width, then Ozil would have had a bit more protection, and that sense of Ozil not really chipping in defensively and not really players like that, they shouldn't have to do that. Really, it's not okay. Jose Mourinho can turn Wesley Sneijder into a 6, but these instances are rare and they're not by and large very successful. So I think what Wenger did there with Ozil was maybe to reach for a player who, in kind of absolute terms, was an extraordinary player, but in terms of the style and system and how Arsenal like to play, required too many tweaks to what they were otherwise seeking to do in order for it to work out quite so well. And that's why it didn't necessarily. There's also going to be people screaming assist figures at this now, going, "Oh, but he's got more assists." It's like, well, yeah, okay. I'm still right, I think.
Sure. Well, we'll find out. Before we finish, what I am going to ask you is how Arsene Wenger will be remembered, which is a very difficult question to answer. So before you do, to give you some time to think about that, Alex, I'm going to read 3 Arsene Wenger quotes. How exciting. I have been very lazy picking these. I thought I'd just choose a few as a sort of cross-section of what Arsene Wenger was like as a man and what we can remember him by. And they get a bit weirder as we go. Quote number 1 is It's understandable, it's very acceptable. It's what we'd expect from Arsene Wenger. Arsene Wenger says young players need freedom of expression to develop as creative players. They should be encouraged to try skills without fear of failure. I think that's something that can apply to us all. Alex, the second quote is, I think in England you eat too much sugar and meat and not enough vegetables. I think that's probably very true, Arsene. And well done for spotting that. And I really do like him. And the third and final quote, this is my favourite Arsene Wenger quote of all time. Just read it today for the first time. And it goes like, please don't think I'm belittling his life or career. It goes like this. It goes, in a competitive world, not everybody can follow the pace. You will have to leave people out. We now accept that we must take care of these people. You cannot let them die in the streets.
Yeah, well, no.
You can't. You just can't let people die in the streets.
Yes, I think that's sort of a truth universally acknowledged.
My favourite thing about that quote is... Sure. Well, let's not make it political. People get upset with us when we do that, even though it's obvious. Right. My favourite thing about that quote is, it's on one of those quote sites where they have a little box. You know the quote sites? Mm-hmm. You know those ones? At the bottom, they have like tags, little hyperlinked tags for each quote. And that third and final one, the tags are die, streets, and everybody. How is that possibly a tagging system?
That's extremely dark.
How could everybody be a tag?
Why would you?
That doesn't make any
sense. But also, who's out there Googling everybody die in the streets?
Well,
and then
weirder things of a Saturday evening. Anyway,
okay.
It's now time for you to answer my question, a question that you've had some time to think about there, Alex. How should or would Arsene Wenger be remembered? Will?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that the phrasing of that question, and indeed a lot of the coverage after he announced this resignation, it was as if he died.
Yeah.
And he hasn't died.
Well, he might as well have died.
Well, he's retiring from a football club, so it's not quite the same thing. Do
you think he'll come out with a cracking book?
I would love him to come out with a cracking book, yes.
I think his
book... But what I'd love
is... Forgive my French, shit all over Ferguson's book, don't you think? Less gossipy, more philosophical. That would be the cliché.
That's what I'd really like, actually. I'd be less interested in necessarily a sort of a behind-the-scenes thing. I mean, there's... For those who are interested and are still with us, by the way, Amy Lawrence's book on the Invincibles... on that season, the 2003-04 season, is awesomely good. So you should buy it if you haven't got it. But no, I think he will be seen as one of the two transformative figures of the Premier League, along with Ferguson. I think that there's no way that the Premier League would be at the stage it's at now, or would have got there as quickly were it not for him, and his influence in terms of scouting, the use of statistics, the conditioning, nutrition, all of that kind of stuff. But also, I think more importantly, opening the Premier League out to a group of players who, yeah, I mean, sure, there had been foreign players in the league prior to Wenger turning up, but having that knowledge and the appreciation of parts of the game outside of England and Scotland, and bringing in younger players that people hadn't heard of, not just going for kind of big name signings who'd performed at the World Cup, that kind of stuff. He was one of the first people to really kind of dig into that and to make it core to what he was doing. And yeah, I mean, he's extraordinarily important to English football.
Thank you very much for joining us, Alex. We'll speak to you again next week.
You will indeed.
And Arsene Wenger, au revoir.